So let's talk about ecological niche and keystone species. This is what the syllabus objective says. You need to define ecological niche, understand the competitive exclusion principle, and define keystone species. Firstly, ecological niche. This definition comes from the QCAA. It's actually from the syllabus, and it says ecological niche is the role and space that an organism fills in an ecosystem, including all its interactions with the biotic and abiotic factors of its environment. So it's the role or service that the species provides to its ecosystem. Is it a filter feeder that cleans the ocean, or is it a decomposer, or is it a producer that produces the biomass? And its space, or where it actually occupies in the ecosystem, its habitat, and that's dictated by the abiotic factors in which it can tolerate and exploit, but also its interactions with other species as well. So we could consider ecological niche is where an organism lives and what it does. So here's an example of a species that's occupying a niche. This yellow species of barnacles is on a cliff wall right next to the ocean. This is an intertidal zone. So high tide is maybe somewhere around here, and maybe so there's periods of time when this species is out of the water, and so they're the abiotic factors that it has to be exposed to. It needs to have adaptations to allow it to tolerate being out of the water for periods of time. But you can see it occupies this distinct band here, and below that there's another species of organism. But it's a good distinct band, and you don't see this species any further up the cliff wall because it's the abiotic factors of the duration of time out of water and the heat and the sun and the waves, etc., limit the species from occupying further up the cliff wall, and competition with this species down here limit the species occupying a niche that's further down the cliff wall as well. So this takes us to consideration of the fundamental and the realized niche. Look, many organisms cannot occupy the whole complete niche in which they're able to occupy due to competition. So we have a fundamental niche, which is this theoretical habitat where a species has the adaptations to be able to live and survive if there was no competition. So this grey species here, you can see that it's able to occupy this whole cliff wall if there's no competition. We call that the fundamental niche. But when there's competition, so from this pink species of barnacles, we can see that it can't occupy the whole niche anymore because it's actually outcompeted down lower. And this grey species must have adaptations that mean that it's better suited to higher up on the cliff wall. So that ends up being the realized niche. It's the actual habitat that's occupied by the species when there's competition, and it's smaller than the fundamental niche. The competitive exclusion principle says that no two species can occupy exactly the same niche at the same time. Put two species together and one will outcompete the other one. So that's competitive exclusion, where you see there's only one species is able to occupy the niche, but often what really happens in nature is what we call resource partitioning, where we have two realized niches that tend to be smaller than the fundamental niche, and they're able to share that area. And it's dictated by how well the species are adapted to those particular abiotic factors. On a cliff wall, it's zonation, so there's actually a variation in the abiotic factors as we go up or down the cliff wall. So that's why we have partitioning in that way. The classic example of competitive exclusion is with bacteria. Two species of bacteria are living by themselves. You can see their population is high. When they're growing together, one species continues to thrive, but the other species, you can see, actually dies out. And here's another example of resource partitioning. This time, a species, the yellow bird species, when they're by themselves without competition, they occupy the whole fundamental niche. However, when there's competition from this red bird, they occupy a realized niche, which is smaller. So if we were to have a look at our yellow species again, and we're able to work out their population, we would see that the majority of this species actually occupies that middle part of the band. Fewer of the species are able to live further up, and fewer are able to live further down. And this is because the conditions are more challenging. So if we have a look at that, you can see that it's a bell curve. Most of organisms are going to live in what we can call a preferred niche, where the abiotic factors are optimal. Abiotic and biotic factors are optimal. There's outside of that, we can see that there's some hardier individuals in the population that can tolerate living outside those optimal conditions, but they might be smaller, or there's less of a population of them because they are undergoing physiological stress, because the abiotic and biotic factors are not as optimal. Outside of that, they're not able to occupy it because they don't have the adaptations to be able to tolerate it. The last thing is about a keystone species. This definition is from the syllabus as well. A keystone species is a plant or animal that plays a unique and crucial role in the way an ecosystem functions. Relative to their abundance, they have a disproportionately large role within an ecosystem that contributes significantly to the biodiversity of the ecosystem. For example, like the cassowary here, it might provide a critical service in seed dispersal, or it might control the population of a dominant species. Like, for example, this fish is one of the only species that eats the algae growing on coral. Or it might provide critical resources like, for example, plant species that are producers and produce biomass. Or they might be the engineers like the worms that actually break down and aerate soil, for example. Often we don't know a keystone species until they're gone. We didn't appreciate how important the role was that was provided by the keystone species until it becomes extinct.